Our session today, we're going to take a closer look at the data request process and how the Data Cookbook can support you in building a streamlined and path for your data consumers to request data. Format, simple format. First I'm going to describe the problem. Then I'm going to show you how you can solve the problem of data request. If you do have a chaotic situation, you can solve that problem in 3 different ways. And I'm going to use a framework of 3 different types of users and show you how to create a process based on those user types. Experienced user, a casual user, and using a proxy user in Data Cookbook. And we're gonna actually look at Data Cookbook, and I'm going to demo those 3 solutions. And then we're going to do a comparison of those 3 solutions just to kind of wrap things up in a summary. So what's the problem? The problem is that many institutions that we talk to have a convoluted, multi-threaded path for their users to request reports or request an extract or some type of data deliverable. The process is unclear to many of these consumers, and what's the starting point? What's available to me? How do I do this? Some schools have the request processes based on who you know, who your friends are, who you've made contacts with, who has given you good reporting service in the past, so you'll just keep going back to that person kind of thing. It tends to use a lot of just personal email or phone calls or face-to-face requests. So it makes the process, results in a process that is inconsistent, difficult to scale, and unwelcoming to new data users. That's from the users, the requesters' perspective. From the report writer's perspective, when there is not a catalog or a record of the requests being made, report writers tend to, in their need for efficiency, rather than trying to find work that they had done in the past, they would simply just do the work over again. And they would be unable to reuse the material and work that they had done in the past because they had no easy way to find it and track back previously done work. So the problem that this request process solves is creating a streamlined, friendly environment that'll let you scale the number of requesters that are asking to use your data. So this demo that I'm going to show, as I said, has 3 different user types. One is the experienced Data Cookbook user, and they're going to use a path that I call create a specification. Then a casual Data Cookbook user, they're going to use an easier path called find information. Then the last user requester type is called the proxy Data Cookbook user, and that's an environment where there is an external ticketing system, request system that may be in place, and you want to use the Data Cookbook as a companion to that pre-existing ticketing system. So let's take it from the perspective of the experienced Data Cookbook user. I'm going to pop over to the demo account, and I am going to log in as a staff member named Dan Helper. And Dan is an experienced data user, and he's going to make a request for a report for student retention advisors that pulls out the major, the enrollment status is active, and their GPA in STEM. So he's looking for a list of students enrolled in STEM programs. So he's highly skilled, so he goes to specifications, create a specification, and fills out this worksheet. He titles his request, and because, again, he's highly trained, he knows to choose report request as his specification type. So that presents him with a worksheet. This is quite a bit of information that he's expected to fill in, but again, he's highly trained, and so he asks for this in enrollment. So he provides a clear purpose, a very well-structured purpose, and he provides a description. He's going to say, as a reminder, he wants to make sure that that report writer uses preferred name and doesn't want them to use the legal name of the student. And he provides a date. He's going to give, he realizes holidays coming up. He's going to say, I don't need this until July 14th. And it's of medium. And he doesn't have any other comments. So he's going to click Save. After he clicks Save, he receives the full template, spec template version. As you can see, this is quite a bit of information that he would be expected to fill in. But again, he's highly trained. So he knows to go to data items, and he's going to provide that report writer with some definitions. He knows he wants major. He actually wants major, and he wants the major for STEM. And he sees that he doesn't have that. He keywords on major. He says he doesn't have a STEM major. So he's going to, we're going to skip over that for just a minute and come back to it. But we're going to do enrollment status. And we're going to communicate that we need that enrollment status to be active. And the last one a couple more we're going to do is we need, he only wants full-time students. And we're going to stop there. And he's going to go back over, now that he went through those definitions, he's going to go back and annotate his overview, his notes, because he wants to say a little bit more about that he needs a STEM GPA. For those of you on the call who are experienced Data Cookbook users, you saw he could have created a definition on the fly there and started that STEM GPA definition, but I'm going to hypothesize here and say he's not going to, I don't want to put it in access details, I want to put it down here in additional details. So it's just illustrating that, sure, he's an experienced user, but he's not interested in creating definitions from scratch. So he just interacts with that and communicates and says, I do want this definition. Please take care of it for me in this way. So with that, I want to point out one other thing back on the, he's also going to communicate in the overview tab. He's going to communicate that he wants this from a specific system. So he just goes back and forth as he there, he says that, okay. Communicates what he knows about what he wants in this report, and then submits it. He has an opportunity, as many of you know, experienced on the call. He could have said a few more things there, maybe underscored his need for a STEM GPA, or maybe just said, I'm going on vacation next week. Okay. So what's interesting is that this has triggered a workflow that is specific for the people coming in for making a request. So this workflow was specifically designed to handle these requests. And the first step in the workflow, the first stage, is to confirm. So there's someone on the receiving end of this request now that they're going to review this, and then they're going to potentially communicate back to Dan and ask him further questions about what exactly did he need. So you can customize that workflow. I'm going to hide this workflow panel there. You can customize that workflow, and it's customized based on the spec type. Because he chose that spec type of a request, specification request, that triggered a workflow specific to this process. If I go over under organization and show you both, there are two in this demo account, there are two workflows for specification approval. One is this customized one for a request coming in from outside of IT, or IR, kind of just from a regular data consumer, and it's conditioned on a spec type report request. Versus the regular spec approval, if you're not that type, if you're come in through some other mechanism, you traverse a separate workflow, and this separate workflow does not have that step, that formal step of confirming the requirements. So that's just an advanced feature there that you can customize a workflow to handle that extra layer of requirements gathering that you may encounter when you have an experienced user directly submitting requests through the create a spec pathway. From here now, I'm going to log out. I'm going to go back let's go back to our, just as a reminder. Now I'm going to show you the example of the casual Data Cookbook user. And I'm going to log in actually as a guest because a casual requester can simply have viewer access to your cookbook. They have no other. Dan Halper up here in Experienced, he was an editor, which gave him the permissions to create a specification. Now I'm going to log in as a guest. So I'm going to log out as Dan, log in as guest, and you'll see the guest has significantly reduced permissions. The guest does not see the link for create a spec. As you can see, they can't create a definition, they can't create a spec. But they know to start at the home page, and this guest, is going to look for data. This guest is a staff member in the advancement area, and they have $10,000 to spend on an alumni event, and they're trying to decide if they should have the event in Denver or in Chicago. And so they want a list, they want to get more information on the alums they have in both of those metro areas. So maybe they approach this as, they come to the cookbook and they type in alumni address, because that's what they want to report based on alumni address and zip code for those two metro areas. They don't see anything. And maybe well, we'll stop there. So they did a little keyword search on alumni address. They didn't get anything. They go to request additional help. And they say, so they just in natural language state what they want, and then they save it. So they're using what's called the find information request. And now they're done. That's considered submitting a request. What happens behind the scenes is that someone on the other end of this workflow, this information request resolution workflow, has received an email that says there's been a request submitted, go check it out. And I know that that person's name is John. And so John logs in to manage that request. And John's a manager. There's actually 3 or 4 people that could manage this request. John immediately assigns it to, it's this one. John immediately assigns it, who do I want to assign it to Jill. And so he knows that Jill is someone who is trained and ready to respond to these requests. So he assigns it to Jill. So it's now off of John's plate, and Jill just got an email asking her to deal with this information request and reply to it. So Jill logs in. So the workflow, the information request workflow, is what's running this operation behind the scenes. Jill logs in. She says she has a task that this has been assigned to her. Actually, it's this one. And Jill reads this over, and she's fairly experienced with the reporting environment. That's why she's in this job, to field these requests. And she wants to transition this into a information request. Excuse me, she wants to transition this into a into a specification. She knows no pre-existing report deliverables meet this criteria. And I can see here in my example that I didn't do my permissions correctly. And Jill indeed does not have the capacity to do that. Let me back up, log in as John. So a little bit of had I more correctly gotten Jill's permissions established, I would see a link there that allows her to transfer that into create a specification for this report. So she would click this link and also identify guest user as the requester and create that specification. So she transitions that into the spec, similar to what we saw with Dan Helper when he logged in. I'm not going to continue on with that process in the interest of time, but that it shows you how you can take a casual user from that easier starting point where all they had to do was type in that text into a keyword box and then transition them into a formal specification through the information request workflow. To kind of take you over there to show you behind the scenes that workflow for folks. So here's your list of all your workflows. Information request resolution is the name of that workflow, and it's in this workflow that I had some error in this setup of this workflow with Jill and her ability to actually perform the work that I wanted her to do. So that would need further sleuthing for me to figure out. Once she does transition that into a specification, that object then leaves this information request resolution. It gets closed, and then it would traverse through the spec approval workflow. So it would jump over and use this workflow to actually be built and then delivered to the requester. All of which would happen transparent to the casual user, to that guest user. Okay. Last example I want to talk about is a proxy situation. And this is, I commonly see two environments where clients want to use a proxy such situation. One is they just don't have the bandwidth to set up either of these two, and they want to allow the continuation of maybe a chaotic request process, but they are training the recipients, often IT or IR staff, train the recipients to go into the cookbook and transfer that email request or that phone call or that conversation in the parking lot to a formal request on behalf of the requester. And then the staff member uses the cookbook to document the progress of the build of that report and the delivery of that to the end user. But the end user requester never actually touches the cookbook. That's one environment. Second environment is when there is a pre-existing ticketing system for the request process, again, typically going to IT, with some slight frequency it'll go to IR, and that system's working just fine. And there's no need to disrupt that system, but perhaps there is, maybe the data environment has gotten broader and there are some requests that are happening outside of that ticketing system, successful as it may be, and so they want to slowly transition into using the Data Cookbook as a centralized request documentation place and without disrupting this potentially very successful pre-existing ticketing system. So let's take a look at how that would look. I'm going to log in to the Data Cookbook as a username Reese. And Reese, let's say fictitiously, she works in IR and she is the main supplier of Cognos reports on demand, on ad hoc demand Cognos. So she logs in because through her ticketing system, she got a ticket that asked for a Cognos request, asking for a first-year retention monthly report. So she comes into, under her own login, she goes to create a specification, and she has permissions to, editorial permissions to do this, and she puts in her title. And she knows to choose Cognos report as her spec type. So she's going to trigger that other workflow because she did not choose, remember when we before when we chose report request, that drove us to a different workflow. She's going to choose Cognos report, and that's her area of expertise. And this is an enrollment, and her purpose is, so that's an excellent purpose. She's saying who's going to use this report and why they're going to use it, what their purpose is in using it. Her description is, and she's going to save. And she's, the original requester, her name is Lisa. And so Reese can, Reese's name came in here as the requester because she just typed that in, but she can change that to Lisa. And now for the record, it's clear that Lisa did the requesting and Reese is going to build the actual report. And so then Reese would continue to do that work and build that report, and in the end may or may not deliver the specification to Lisa with her final deliverable report. Depends on what the training situation is with Lisa. Again, Lisa's coming in as a proxy and may not know about Data Cookbook. The benefit to Reese and the IT or IR staff is that now there's a record that this work has been done and the report itself has been documented. As a caveat, sometimes this style of approach, the staff will opt to do a rather cursory treatment of the specification itself. Their primary goal is not a detailed documentation of the technical metadata, but rather a discovery opportunity so that, and a statistical opportunity. So Reese gets credit for making a report if she's on a quota to produce a certain number of reports per month. And Reese does not have to spend a whole lot of time. She just simply, maybe is expected to complete the overview tab and then approves the specification. And so by paying good attention to the overview tab, that makes this report highly discoverable should subsequent users come over to the finds data area. Remember, our casual user, our guest user, this information is now available to someone searching across the data landscape, and this reporting object is now discoverable to dozens or hundreds of people. And that would not be true if it was only recorded in the ticketing system in the IT or IR departments. So there's a discoverability that is gained by using the Data Cookbook in your request process, even if you have a well-functioning ticketing system to deliver those data deliverables. So that's the end of the demo piece. Let's take a look then at the comparison of these three approaches. So there's three types. I've called them experienced, casual, and proxy, and I gave them a path name. The Data Cookbook permissions for these user types, experienced has the highest. They need to be an editor for specification. So somebody needed to place them in a user group that had that permission level. Casual user, they are simply viewer. Many of you have the all users user group set up as viewer status. So casual users need no further permissions granted to them in order to participate and make a request. It's a very scalable option. Hundreds of users could be provisioned as in the all users user group and take advantage of this feature. And of course, the proxy users, you saw me, she did link it to Lisa, but proxy users may or may not need to be in the cookbook themselves. Workflows that are used. Specification workflows, of course, are in play for all three choices, and the casual user type also uses the find information. They directly actually use the find information workflow, and then other staff who are building the report utilize the specification workflow in support of that request. And then we have two concepts of training burden, and I separated out the training burden for the requester and the training burden for the report writer. For experienced users, I underscored this several times, the training burden is quite high. I would expect an experienced user to, in order to retain their skill set, to use this feature several times a month, maybe 2-3 times a week. They need to be going in with that frequency in order to be facile and keep their skills up. Casual users, medium, I would say they need more of a communication plan than a training plan. They needs to be communicated to them to start at the Data Cookbook. It needs to be communicated to them to search, and that they are expected to review the data deliverables that they can find in Data Cookbook, and if nothing is found, to then explore an information request approach. Casual users need to be communicated to what happens after they submit an information request. Their ability to track an object through a workflow is a little constrained, and they deserve kind of a visual that's going to tell them, external to the cookbook, what just happened, what can they expect, who's going to get back to them, and how will that occur, and when can they expect to get their data item, the thing that they requested. And of course, for proxies, there's no training for them at all. No training or communication is needed. For the report writers, and I flag these medium, high, and high simply from the point of view of the managing the request, not so much of the build of the report itself, but the report writer, for that experienced requester, somebody, maybe the report writer, maybe it's someone in a stage before the report writer, needs to have a further conversation with that experienced user just to confirm those requirements. Actually, I didn't show that really clearly in the workflow. I pointed out that there were two different workflows, but I didn't actually show you the visual of how they are different. So there's a separate stage. It's blue. So that requester, that experienced requester, is here in drafting, and then someone, maybe the report writer, maybe someone else, maybe a business analyst, is staffing this stage, and their job is to just work on those requirements and confirm that they got the story straight, and then it goes to the build. And then by comparison, the workflow for everything else traverses this, and you can see there is no blue dots and there is no requirements gathering phase, formal requirements gathering phase. Okay, so there's a bit of an expectation that somebody needs to have a back and forth with that requester. Casual, the training burden there, the communication burden could be quite high. There's been much less requirements information given there, and those conversations would need to be had. And proxy, the staff would need to be trained to reassign who the requester was, whether or not that requester's name needed to be associated with the spec. There's a little bit more work required on the burden, a bit on the report writer. So it's a choice. When you're making you're trying to choose which of these paths is going to work best for you, you want to consider which burden is easier for you to meet. I think in larger schools who are trying to scale access to 50, 100, 150 requesters, the casual route is going to be much more scalable and manageable. Folks who want to manage maybe fewer than 50 requesters can probably have a group of experienced requesters who they could consistently train to work their way through that create a spec worksheets. So a couple other ideas behind that is you can mix and match. You could create, I know maybe to say you can have multiple paths may be in conflict with earlier things of suggesting that this is a way to streamline, but it may be, you can view it as streamlined if you've gone from 8 paths down to 3. That is considered a win in terms of the streamlined nature of your request process. So ways to mix and match. You could say certain domains do certain things. Enrollment data requests are always expected to act like a casual guest and use the find data approach. And so then there's a communication plan that gets that message out to folks who tend to request enrollment data. Maybe you want to segment the request process by data system. For all requests for the data warehouse, I want you to use create a specification. And you're expected to be a more experienced user if you're asking for data warehouse data. And last is by service unit. So requests, for example, coming in through the IT might continue to use the IT ticket system and the proxy model. So use some creativity and think through how you want to structure your path and how you want to mix and match the options there. To implement this, a roadmap is extremely helpful. You want to onboard certain groups or subgroups over a 6 or 12 or 18-month period. Obviously, your goal is whatever you design, you want it to streamline and simplify. You're not trying not to add complexity. As I said, if it's not broken, if you've got ticketing systems that are working well, I would not disrupt them. I would try to enhance them. I would look for areas that aren't running well and see if you can use the request process to aid those areas that aren't working well. Data governance is still in an immature state, and if something is working well, folks are not going to respond too positively to, simply for the sake of governance, leaving something that was working well for them and moving to a new method simply under the name of governance. And last, whatever path you choose, monitor their usage. If there is a process or a path that is not being used and you can't figure out how to tweak it you don't want to use it anymore, or you can't figure out how to tweak it to make it more friendly and attractive for use, dismantle it and take it down. It's just confusing to have processes still in place that no one uses and no one attends to.